Okay, so I would like to welcome everybody to tonight's LID session on equitable assessment and grading, featuring three wonderful teachers that happen to recently graduate from East Carolina University's master's program in literacy and reading. And so our sessions, as always, we want to give the shout out to South Carolina Middle Grades Initiative. They fund our webinars, they fund our organization. And so we want to be able to do this without them. But as far as our presentation for this evening, this is a panel presentation. Our fourth person, Noah Goodwin, was unable to attend due to a family emergency. And so I'm just going to briefly introduce all three of our panelists and then get started with questions that we have some prepared questions for them. But also if anybody here has some questions or they want to engage and chat, there is the chat feature in here, but there's also, you're welcome to unmute and make connections and ask questions. So to start, we have Alicia Leonard. She's completing her 15th year as a teacher for the deaf after earning her bachelor's in deaf education from Lenore-Rhine University. She's taught students pre-K-12 in North Carolina and Virginia. After participating in the Advanced Culturally Responsive Literature Instruction Institute at Harvard University and completing the National Endowment for Humanities Institute on Disability and Identity in History, Literature and Media, sponsored by Wayne State University, she decided to return to school to obtain her master's degree, as I said, at ECU. And so that was the Master's in Literacy and Reading, and she was in my assessment courses this semester, as well as we have Olivia Moore. Olivia Moore works at East McDowell Middle School as a reading specialist. Her undergraduate and master's degree from East Carolina University. She says in her little bio, go Pirates, absolutely agree. Her passion is reading, and she's determined to help all of her students feel confident with reading. Those who don't enjoy reading just haven't found the right books yet. I got to see this live last week when I was in a classroom with her and watched her engage with the students as she kind of stepped into a classroom reading a book in a social studies 7th grade. Then we also have the wonderful Kelli Madkins, who's a dedicated middle school teacher who's passionate about inspiring young minds and fostering a love for learning. She has had the privilege of teaching in Texas and North Carolina, allowing her to gain diverse experiences in education and creating an engaging, inclusive, and supportive learning environment where every student can thrive. She has taught for 14 years and has over 20 years in the United States Air Force. She has a Master's of Arts in Education in Reading and Literacy from ECU and a Master's of Arts in Human Services Counseling, Marriage and Family from Liberty University. So this is really a great opportunity to listen and learn about what equitable assessments look like and mean to teachers that are in middle school classrooms, for those of you that are not attending live and watching the recording. So I want to welcome everybody and welcome our panelists. So to get us started, the first question is, what does equitable assessment mean to each of you? So I'm going to start with Olivia, and then Olivia, when you finish, you get to tag whoever is going next, and that way we can kind of go from there. Does that make sense?
Yep. Okay, what does equitable assessment mean to me? Well, I think the biggest thing, in my opinion, is letting kids showcase their strengths. A lot of times the standardized tests that we use sometimes can highlight their weaknesses, and they're making our kids feel bad. I mean, we've all seen that this week with EOGs and last week and, the month of end of May, beginning of June. It's kind of it can be a weird month in schools. Kids start to feel really down. So equitable assessments are going to build them up. They're going to make them feel good. They're going to showcase what they know already, and then we can build off of that. So we're going to showcase those strengths through different means of assessments. That can look like different passages, different ways that they can show their learning instead of just a multiple choice test. So there's a lot of parts to it, but I think the biggest thing is that it's going to show their strengths instead of just their weaknesses. Oh, I'm supposed to tag somebody. Kelli.
Okay, so I did make some notes with some little bullet points here. I said that an equitable assessment is like this approach to evaluating student learning and the difference between equitable and I would think every other assessment is that we're really focusing on it being fair and inclusive. And that's regardless of students' backgrounds or abilities, circumstances, and opportunities. And so how we're going to do that is by having varied type of assessments that really focus on being fair, being accessible, being diverse, and including like student involvement is a big one too, like kind of surveying students maybe before an assessment or even after when we're doing the reflective piece. I think that all kind of ties into equitable assessments. Tagging Alicia.
So it's a little tough to follow all of that up because y'all have talked about a lot of what it means. But for me, and I was just kind of succinct in this one, it's assessing what's been taught at that student's level of understanding. Speaking with EOGs and students that I work primarily with deaf and hard of hearing students who are working very far behind their peers for the most part. And they are being assessed this week on stuff that they've not been taught because that's not where they are at. And so with equitable assessments for them specifically, and overall, you don't want to test things that they've not been able to be taught because they're not there yet. So you want it at their level of understanding, and you want that differentiation piece. You want that where they can show those strengths. So that's my thing, is making sure it's what's been taught and that they can do it at their level.
So I know later we're going to talk about an example of an assessment that you've changed or modified, but is there a way to so you each kind of talked about different pieces of what makes it equitable. Do you have examples, like just big picture examples of what we have to do for assessments to be equitable? So it's not necessarily the example you're going to talk about and share, but like, what do we have to do to make sure that our assessment process is equitable?
Well, you have to get to know your students first and foremost. You can't give them equitable assessments if you don't know who they are. So you really have to take the time to get to know them as people, and not just how they learn, but who they are. What do they like? What's their identity? What do they have a ton of knowledge on? If you don't know that stuff, you're not going to be able to give them equitable assessments.
So somebody tell me more about, so once you know who the students are, how does that connect to the assessment that you give?
So
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Alicia.
Go, Kelli. Go ahead.
Okay. I was just thinking about when we were reviewing, when I taught in Texas, one thing that we realized when we were looking at assessments and how they were not equitable is it was asking questions about like being on the beach, and some of our students had never been on the beach before. So kind of tying into what Olivia said, like first you have to know your students, which means, asking questions, getting to know them, but then it's that exposure, like they don't know what they don't know. So we have to make sure that we're expanding their knowledge. And so, and also going back to what Alicia said, we're assessing them on what they know, but then also kind of taking it to the next level of teaching them more and building on that. And I don't even know if I answered all your question. Can you repeat it? Was that it? Okay.
You're good. I was gonna have Alicia if she still wanted to answer.
Okay.
I actually had something kind of to go off of the first question about making the assessments more equitable. And Olivia covered and Kelli's talked about, from the student standpoint, what we need to do. But I was sitting there thinking today, because I've had different students in different districts take pencil and paper tests, and those are very difficult to get. And I think part of what we will also have to do is change a mindset of the adults that we can't do what's easiest for us sometimes. And whether that's at a standardized level, the state EOGs of it's easier to put them on a computer. It's easier to have them click. We get our results much quicker. But at the same time, that's not appropriate for some of our kids. They need to physically highlight. They need to physically do these things if they're taking that standardized assessment. But then, even for when we are assessing just in our classroom, giving those extra opportunities and tailoring what we can to them of, if we know they don't know about the beach, see if there's another passage, see if there's something else that we can assess the same skills but something they know.
Well, and if going back to that example about the beach, if we know that they've never been to the beach, then giving them a passage about that is not going to be equitable, because think of all the vocabulary in there that's going to have to do with the beach. You've got dunes, coral, certain types of sea life might come up. I don't know. I mean, there could be anything, current, things like that, that they have no background knowledge on. So they can't picture that. They can't make connections with it, which is what everybody says is a good comprehension strategy. I mean, we know that research shows that those comprehension strategies with connecting and knowing your vocabulary, that's going to help you comprehend a text. Well, if you can't connect and you don't know those vocabulary words because you've never seen them in real life or never even heard those words, it doesn't matter how good of a reader you are. If you just don't know it and don't have the background information for it, you won't be able to answer the questions right. And then it's not an equitable assessment.
So what I hear all three of you really talking about is this idea of thinking about the purpose of the assessment. You know, is it to determine their background knowledge about a beach, or are you assessing a specific skill that has been taught? And so a few of you had mentioned standardized assessments. And so when we think about a standardized assessment, and thinking about your case study as well, since you all three of you worked with one student and gathered lots of different types of information from your student to be able to make decisions, you know, what are some of the problems with a standardized assessment that make it inequitable?
I mean, what I just was rambling on about, that's a big one. Every child has different experiences and different schema. And so even a child that might have good comprehension skills might not be able to show that on a standardized assessment, as well as a child who has a better background knowledge on that passage or text or whatever.
And what about so that's the passages in the assessment. What are some other, and so that's definitely true. And so when we think about a standardized assessment, does that tell us like, I mean, when we think about formative versus summative, so formative is ongoing things that we can do to assess, versus summative. When we think about the end of grade assessment, besides the passages, what other problems, you know, are kind of created? Because we make a lot of decisions based off of just the end of grade assessment. So why is that not equitable?
Not just the reading, or are we talking across content? Because I just did science today. And I'm sure this has been said by almost every educator, their test of stamina, if nothing else. I mean, you've got kids that are sitting there from third grade up, sitting for 2.5 hours, possibly maybe even 3, sitting, and they may have where they can't sit still for that long. They're zoning out after, 30 to 45 minutes. And they've shown what they know in that first section, but they've still got to complete the rest of it. And for that matter, any content ones I've given, a lot of times it's not testing that content knowledge. They're document-based questions that are higher level than the text, that are referenced, like stuff with the Constitution, legal type things, newspapers. Those are much higher level than what these kids are reading at, even maybe 8th grade. And it's not really testing, well, do you know about the women's rights movement? It's, can you connect this document to what's being asked? And while that's an important skill, is that what we really need to know right now?
And then to build off of what Alicia is saying, where that test just looks at one day, when we look at our formative assessment across the whole year, we can see what they know when they're able to show us in different ways. Whereas that one test it's one day. They always say, where we always tell our students, one test does not define you. And then you look at teachers, and that's all that defines us, is what the state says our growth looks like and what our proficiency looks like. That's how schools are defined. We're graded on that one test. But if we were to do that, it's not okay. We have to look at a whole year of formative assessment, observations, projects, different things that let them showcase their strengths and not just the one day.
And building back off of that, I've worked with various students who have grown in those formative assessments with stuff they've done with their classroom teacher, stuff with me, year and a half, and you've got to make that growth to close gaps. But then when they're still that much farther behind on those standardized tests, that's what we look at. We know it's important to see those day-to-day things. But in the end, when they're looking at these school report cards and the growth for the school, they're looking at those one-day numbers.
And then the format with multiple choice also. You know,
Yes.
you could be a really good guesser sometimes and get those right. That doesn't always tell us what we need to know about students. And that's why we all kind of mention, like, you have to have different types. It has to be a variety and it has to be over time.
I love hearing so many different things. You know, you all have touched on, if it's an assessment that is not on their own independent reading level, then are we really assessing those skills? Because we already knew going in that the texts were going to be potentially too difficult. As another recap point, you talked about how these assessments, like they control and they influence a lot about how schools and teachers are graded. But when you get into the high school level, it determines if a student graduates. And so, you know, there is a lot of implication. And as you all mentioned, that assessment, you know, not only is assessing stamina, it's assessing that can they read on grade level, but it's assessing a whole gamut of skills and strategies. And so you all have kind of talked about this idea of this formative assessment. Like, we need these different ways to assess, to really, and you all have talked about it, and I love it, to focus on the student's strengths. Like, where is the student's strength at, so that you can understand the growth areas and support them then moving forward. And so you've touched on this a little bit, but why? So it's kind of a two-part. Why are equitable assessments important to you and or your students or your student population? Because you all have very different demographics and settings in the schools that you work at. And so you can either take one or the other or both of why is it important to you? Why is it important, having equitable assessments important to your student population? And I'm going to start this time with Kelli.
So I'll say why it's important to me. And I touched on this when I first started your course about, like, I have serious test anxiety, you know, so just seeing the name assessments in the title of the course made me very anxious. And I think that that's very true for a lot of our students, because like we've said, it is, you know, one day or, you know, one passage that's really determining a lot. So for me, having equitable assessments is really just having a variety where students can showcase, you know, their knowledge, how they're doing. And so I love doing, you know, debates or one pagers, book reports, all these different things. And like we said, over time, not just in one span. And then also being reflective about that. I think sometimes because as educators, we have like all the things to do. It's easy for us to be complacent if we've already created an assessment to just use that again. But to make sure that we're going back to it and reflecting and seeing if it still best serves, you know, our students and really helps us to understand how they've grown. So yeah, as a person that not necessarily would say I test well, it's important to me because I see having those different opportunities and having the feedback and having a variety of ways to just really demonstrate what I know has made all the difference for me. So I want to do that for my students.
Thank you. Olivia, did you unmute? You did. Go ahead.
So I am going to talk about why it's important to my student population. So one, I mean, just to tie back into everything I've been saying and we've all been saying, I have a very high population of low poverty, did I say that right? Or of impoverished students. So when you think about that background information, they don't have the same experiences as kids that live in a wealthier area might have. So you're asking them to read texts and answer questions about things that they might not have experienced and have that background information on. So same thing that I was saying earlier, but a whole nother part of my answer is that we have a very high population of kids with trauma. And when you have all these assessments that just put them down and they can't seem to pass, no matter, like, year after year, they just cannot pass. They start to feel defeated. While by the time they're in middle school and they've never passed a EOG, they stop caring. And we don't want them to stop caring. But when you've got kids that are dealing with things outside of school and they have trauma in their lives, and then they still can't, like, they can't pass a test on top of that, why would they care? So when we start to give equitable assessments and they start to get a little bit of confidence, like, oh, I can do this, then they start feeling more encouraged and more motivated to read, which is really what we should be getting out of our kids. We want to motivate them. It doesn't matter what they score on an end of grade test. If they like to read and they're reading and they're working at it, that's all I ask for as a teacher. So when you have kids that have a lot of trauma and more to think about than just school, then it's important to give them that confidence through equitable assessment.
So Olivia, based on that comment, this, idea that they stop caring because they've been told that they're failures over and over based on a specific assessment, like that's it, like this is the end all be all. And so do these assessments take into consideration the extreme amount of literacy that takes place in their lives? Like, is it realistic literacy? Maybe I'm trying to ask. I mean, is this the assessment when it assesses main idea and comprehension? Are these the only ways to assess if our students are engaged and comprehending? That was a confusing question. Yes.
No.
Okay.
There are definitely better ways that we can test whether they're engaged and motivated.
And even comprehending. I mean, from my experience just in your school, the one day, which were only 3 classes, the 7th graders, but I think that there's so many ways that I was able to see just from conversations and reading a book and discussing, were we still bringing in the students' comprehension?
Absolutely.
And
Just
so maybe go ahead.
Just by having conversations about the books and asking them questions that they can make those connections. And we did a lot of connecting that day. And I mean, that is a form of comprehension. When you can take what's happening in a text and connect your own life to it and have a conversation about it, I think that shows the highest level of comprehension. If you can have a conversation about what you're reading.
And so I wanted to make sure I stopped on that, because that was, I think a lot of students or a lot of teachers, they do work in Title I schools. And this awareness of, well, what are we assessing? Are these skills that, who determines what we're assessing, so to speak, and how are we viewing the assets that our students are coming into the classroom with, those literacy rich lives that they're bringing in the conversations. And if they don't match the standardized assessments, then that could be a problem. And so that's one of those pieces for the inequity. And so Alicia, I want to jump in to go for you to go ahead and respond. Sorry about that.
It's okay. So I don't remember if it was in my bio or what I've said. I work with students who are deaf and hard of hearing. And right now I'm at a Title I magnet school. And for me and for these kids and any of the kids I've worked before, the standardized tests are not equitable. They need to show what they can do, and it's better and more equitable for them to test them against themselves, see what kind of growth we've made each year. So to me, it's important to see that growth and make sure the gaps are closing and be equitable with that and say, okay, I know we've worked on this set of words. Do you truly know them? Can we use them in a conversation? Can we, if we're just playing, does it just pop out and you're using it like that? Or are you having to take a second to retrieve it? It's so vital because they need the words, the communication, not just for reading, not just for their academics, but this is some of them, they have to learn to catch up just to be able to converse and have fun conversations with their peers, with their family. And so when I'm assessing and thinking about why it needs to be important and be equitable, it's so that they can go out and be productive adults and not just in the reading world, but just communicating. And I had a lot of what I was had kind of prepped for this one. I had already talked about earlier when we were talking about what does it mean for equitable assessment. So I'm kind of struggling a little bit, but it's frustrating to assess them, like Olivia's talking about, when I've got a lot of mine that have never passed those EOGs. They're at the point of saying, what's the point? And so it's better to give them some confidence. And I think about my case study student that I worked with. We were doing something today. We've been doing testing. And so during their class time, I'm like, okay, let's just, kind of take some time and rest. And he was trying to tell somebody about the story we had read a couple of weeks before prepping for the EOGs. And he was able to retell that whole story. It was a little bit out of order, but he was essentially teaching it. And we know that if you can teach, you clearly understood what was going on. He was paying attention, and that was better comprehension than I ever saw him do with if he was just reading it. But it was interactive when we were teaching and everything else. So that's where, if we teach it at their level, if we're being equitable with what we're teaching, we can actually assess equitably. And that's probably the most important thing is, again, like I said earlier, at their level of understanding and what's actually been taught.
And that observation of that student probably told you more about him and his growth than a multiple choice test ever could.
Oh yeah, because he would fly through it and be done in about 10 seconds.
Yep.
So Alicia and I had a very unique, before the semester even started, experience and conversation. And so, it's one of the things I've known of this, and I've thought about assessments, and, if it's a 10th grade EOG, it's on 10th grade reading levels or higher. And because I taught 10th grade as a reading intervention, so that's why I went with that grade level, even though we have middle school people here. And so I'm used to thinking about the assessments not being equitable based on the readability, and the fact that, you're assessing all of these things that may or may not have been just taught. And so are you really assessing what has been taught, so that you can inform instruction? But Alicia and I had these conversations because in her teaching situation, most of the assessments don't even work, because of her students being deaf and hard of hearing. And so Alicia, are you comfortable talking a little bit about, how some of those, like, words their way or whatever they may be, that they don't even take into consideration deaf and hard of hearing students?
Yeah, and I mean, that's a lot of tests. We do vocabulary tests every year to assess for growth. That's one of those where I was talking about, assessing the kid against themselves. What growth did you make with this same test? So we are being valid we're not comparing an apple to an orange, but at the same time, whenever we write those in documents and evaluations, we say, these are not normal deaf students. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. And any of the, the assessments I did, currently I have some students who sign completely or profoundly deaf. I have some students who are spoken language. I picked a student who was kind of in the middle, but he was one that I felt was very motivated, would be very engaging, and he very much was. But a lot of the assessments with phonological components, he did not do well on, because that was a skill that had been, I don't know if it had been skipped over. I don't know if it was, attempted and he wasn't making progress. But now that he's in 6th grade, it's, do you sit there and focus on those pieces? Do you go back and try to teach him how to segment and blend, or do you teach him the whole words? And so it's frustrating with the assessment piece of, how do you truly assess where he is? He can sit there and rattle off words when we talk about bats and echolocation. He's talked about constellations. He can recall these things that we talk about in class, but then he can't sit there and take the word mushroom, possibly. I'm looking around at recipes that are sitting here. He couldn't take the word mushroom and actually read it without knowing the word. He would kind of blank if he didn't know the word to begin with, or he'd try to make it match something else and try to, instead of phonetically trying to take it apart. But then for the rest of my students, especially the signers, it's very frustrating to sit there and go, well, how do we teach them words when they cannot, or it's very difficult for them to unlock that code? To sit there and see a S means SH, or if you see cat, this is cat, that's the son. But if you've got catatonic, if you've got Catholic, those aren't related to cats. And so how do you sit there, teach them thousands and thousands of words that we need to know? And so when you're assessing all of that, like we've talked about, you've got to bring in their funds of knowledge, all their outside literacy, and look at those versus just these standardized assessments that were not made for them.
I appreciate you sharing that. Because I remember, and you have a student that was able to engage with most of the assessments or some very small modifications, but with some of your students, when we do fluency, oral reading, even spelling, the spelling test, because it was verbal, like there has to be a consideration of a lot of modifications to truly go back to, well, what is the purpose? What am I trying to assess? And then what's the best way to get that information specific for your student and your students' needs and their students' identities and backgrounds? And so that awareness of having to make a lot of changes to an assessment to be truly equitable per student, I don't think is thought of, especially in the setting that you work in.
Right.
So I want to go to our next question, and this is the last prepared question of an example of an assessment that either you have modified or something that you really have you've embedded in your classroom and your teaching or working with other teachers that you feel is truly equitable. And so talk through the assessment, talk through why you consider equitable. Just like you're gonna have the floor for a few moments to kind of walk through all about this assessment, or multiple. So some of you might talk about gathering multiple assessments so that you have that holistic data. But I'm going to start with Alicia, because if you didn't notice, each person got to start first. So go, if you're comfortable, go ahead.
Okay. So I had to think on these because there's so many of the assessments that I do have to give that are limited on how I can modify. But for one of the vocabulary assessments that I have to give, the receptive one word and the expressive one word picture vocabulary test that we give, within the state, we do various ones like that. And so for one of my signers, what I did, instead of trying to make sure I get this when I say it right, for the receptive, the test is actually given. When you give it the proper way, you have like 3 or 4 pictures and you give them a word, you say the word, they're supposed to pick whatever the picture that matches with it. So you might have an elephant, you might have whatever, and it gets harder as you go. For one of my signing kids, for signers, we would have to finger spell. So it becomes a test of whether you can read that spelling. And with one specifically, I know his reading level is at a decent place. And so what I started doing is I would write out the word. And it's still that spelling piece, but it's not having to read finger spelling, which is a slightly harder thing. He can look at it and have that snapshot. And it made it a little bit more appropriate for him to know that he was truly getting to be assessed on if he could recognize the word and know what it was versus the finger spelling. And I will say, like, for early signs in that test, if it's like ball, if it's cat, something like that, that you can sign. But as you get up into words, ecosystem or biome or something like that, there's not signs for it. So that's where that finger spelling kind of comes into play. What was the other one? We also, in my ELA class, we have a curriculum I've been using, and there's an online component, and there have some assessments at the end of that. And instead of having them do them independently, we will walk through as a class. And a lot of times I'll assess them formally before we do that, but then we'll go through, and that way they get a little practice and they can feel confident in going through and doing it. So those are probably the 2 main ones I can think of that I have tried to adjust a bit for my kids, but it's still, at the end of the day, they're having to take those other ones that aren't able to be adjusted.
So I want to open the floor before we go to either Kelli or Olivia. Does anybody want to ask questions about the assessments that Alicia's sharing and modified thoughts? Charlene, thank you. I see you unmuted.
I know I have a question, but it's for like at the end, when we're finished with, it's not necessarily on this one.
Okay. Does anybody have a question? And that include panelists to talk through what Alicia described for these two examples?
Well, I just wanted to know more about when you said that you spell it out. Like, I'm a little ignorant with this, so I wanted you to explain that. Yeah.
No, I'm in a
So-
niche field within education. I understand.
So you were saying that they have to do it, like spell it out, but then you said you wrote it out. So I guess I was just trying to understand that.
So instead of like me doing the finger spelling, which
Mm-hmm.
has to be, you know, you've got to read it and be more careful. Like if the word, I would like literally have like a whiteboard and write out the word. And since they're having to interact with the text so much more when they're reading, it might give them a little bit more of a chance to recognize it versus it being with the finger spelling. And the fact that this takes longer, if I'm spelling ecosystem and I muddled that at the end, that's going to take a lot longer than reading that word on a sheet of paper. And there's a chance that you've seen that in science and you're not going to, you know, kind of wear down after a couple of letters and having to remember all those pieces together. Because again, like with our deaf signing kids, we do teach them the chunk. So you'd have like ecosystem, but that's got to count what's 9 letters to keep in your brain and remember what they mean versus seeing it on a piece of paper. I'm hoping that's making sense.
No, it's making a lot. You're teaching me a lot of things. Yeah.
Cool.
So can I ask a question on top of that though? So if there is a sign for something, can you use the sign? Because that concept, yeah, so you can get the concept to them if you don't have to finger spell.
Right. Like I said, like if
Okay.
it's the early ones, dog, maybe even like mother, father, things like that, like very simple ones. There's ones to start with. And even as we got higher into the test, there are certain ones that, oh, that one does have a sign, we can use it. But there's so much with sign language, especially with your adjectives. Like if you needed large, well, large, big, they all have the same sign. You just have different expressions, different mouth morphemes, different things. And so if you're truly testing, if they know, say the word enormous, giving them big is going to give them, you know, kind of a picture. So it's better to kind of give that to, if you're truly wanting to know if they have that vocabulary, it's good to know it. And that gets into some debate sometimes between various people, and this has been throughout my career because I was interpreting / teacher for the deaf for my first several years of my career, moved, and I've done a variety across the spectrum of deaf ed. And it's the question of how fair is it when ASL does truly have more expansion. On one of the tests, there was one about a flamingo. Well, you could sign pink bird, but if you only have one pink bird, that's going to give it to them versus knowing that word flamingo.
Thank you, Alicia.
You're welcome.
Kelli and Olivia, who would like to go next to talk about their assessments that they've changed, modified, or what they look like so that they're equitable?
I can go next. Okay. So 2 that are like right at the forefront of my mind, just because we've been working on it. One is a podcast. And so it is the assessment that I have for my students after we finished our verse novels. And so there were multiple parts to this. And they said originally, like, oh, I can't believe you're making me do this. But it really showed like their comprehension without doing this multiple choice, you know, about the characters, and we built off of it. So we did, you know, different literature circles where they're working with the group who read the same book as them. And then they had to create this script. And I would say in the creation of their script, and then we just used Flip to like do the audio. And in me listening to their podcast, it gave me way more. I could immediately tell like who read the entire book, who didn't. And I could also tell like if they got the theme, you know, were they able to connect, you know, with the different characters. And so that is probably like one of my favorite projects or assessments, and really seeing, you know, what they know. And also it really tests them in how they collaborate with each other. So that's one that we do. Another one, is that I've taken like a released test and with the passages and the questions, and I take away all of the answer choices, and we do a sort of like a gallery walk, if you will, like out in the hall, and the critical thinking that they do when they don't have answers to like guess from, is just, it really took it to the next level. And then they're discussing like why they think it is what it is, and then I give them the answer choices back, and they say how much easier it is to pick the answer once they haven't looked at the answer choices, once they just focused on the question and going back to the text and getting their textual evidence. So I would say those are two ways that I think I've kind of adapted or shifted in a way to make it more equitable, and also I think a little bit more fun than a typical assessment.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up for questions or conversations with what Kelli just shared.
I love that, taking the answers away and then like shaping what they're saying so that then they are confident in what they're going to select as the multiple choice. That's like a metacognitive kind of thing. Also, you're preparing them for the self-talk that has to happen instead of just going A, B, C, or D.
I agree with that. I'm going to steal it just so you know. Thanks.
Does anybody else want to connect? Wanda, I'm assuming you know this, but just in case you don't have video on. That's okay if you don't want to have it. I just didn't know if you knew.
Yes, I am not in the proper attire to be in video.
Do you see what I'm wearing? I'm not going to push you. You're good.
So I apologize, but I'm here and I'm listening.
I love it. Does anybody else want to connect or converse about the examples Kelli shared? Olivia, you're up.
Okay, well, I thought of a couple different things, but I think I'm landing on a choice board because I love a good choice board. And I think when kids have a choice in how they show their learning, they're going to show us more of what they're learning because they chose, that's how they're going to show it. So, let's see, anytime we read a novel, or if we do book clubs or something, instead of just giving them questions or say like, hey, write a book report. I've never done that, but I know some people do. I give them a choice of how they can show me what they learned from the book. For example, writing a poem, or well, a book report might be a choice because some kids might actually choose that. So that could be a choice. Making a collage of pictures that connect to the book somehow, writing a skit and acting it out. All those are different ways that they can showcase what they learned from the book, or not even just books. I remember one time a couple years ago, it was a 5th grade social studies / ELA class, and we were learning about the Revolutionary War and the mounting tensions in the colonies that led to that, and all the different acts that the colonists had to follow. And so each group had a different act that they had to teach the rest of the class about, and they all had a choice on how they wanted to do that. And this one group wrote a rap about King George taxing the colonists, and it was the best thing I have ever seen. I still have a video of it on my computer somewhere, but it was so good, and they had so much fun doing it, and they're probably 10th or 11th grade now, and I'm sure they could tell me all about those acts and maybe even sing that song because they did so good with it. And them choosing to do that was an equitable assessment that I used, and I don't think I did that at first. Maybe that wasn't something I changed, but it's something that I do. So I'm really big on choice boards, and that's really good for your well, it's good for everybody, but it's also good for your AIG population too, because they are able to sometimes go a little deeper into what they are trying to showcase. So I remember sitting in a PD for differentiation for your higher students, and that was one of the things was choice boards. And AIG is your gifted population, if I didn't say that. I think that's all.
Thank you. So even just with 3 people here, and I'm sure that there are lots of, if you're watching this recording, you're thinking, oh, wow, you know, I don't always just give the summative exam. There are ways that I have assessed my students. And so all of you kind of talked about assessments either specific for a skill or after doing something. And earlier you talked about some of those observations and those formative pieces that, you know, are often considered that soft data, but it's still really important data to be able to see on a day-to-day basis how the students are demonstrating their learning. And it's important because it tells you right then and there if you need to reteach something, but it's also really helping you to determine how are you changing your instruction based on the needs that the students are showing on what they're learning. And so, oh, I didn't give a chance. Does anybody have a question or connection or conversation with Olivia share? Sorry, Olivia.
That's okay.
So of course I do. So I'm thinking of all those things that you were doing and you're seeing their progress towards the learning. What would happen if you gave them then the ABCD test after all those presentations? You know, I mean, has that ever been thought of? Yes, you're going from the show me your learning, but does that prepare you to demonstrate your learning on a formalized test? I'm just curious.
Well, I would hope that it would.
No, I think so too. And I just wonder what the correlation is, because it seems like those are the perfect ways to prepare your students for a formalized testing situation. And I'm just curious what the correlation is. I'm just curious.
I don't know that I've ever given a like ABCD multiple choice test after that kind of activity, but I know I've done things like Padlets and where they can, which is like a tool where they can all type in their answers to a question and it pops up on the screen. And I've gotten a lot of good responses and just simple exit tickets and things like that after those. So I don't know that I've ever tested that with an actual test, but I have seen growth and ways that they're showing me their learning as a whole after those activities. So yeah, I mean, I do think that they are beneficial.
They're good preparations. They're good. Good.
And I would think, my computer doing, like y'all were saying, they're good preparations. And I would think if you're showing them to other kids, like they're having to get up and present, that the other kids are learning from their peers. And we know sometimes they learn better from their peers than they do listening to us, frustratingly. I was just going to say after that connection too, I did well in school. I enjoyed school, but I hated getting up and doing a book report. I didn't mind writing it. And so I really wish choice boards would have been a bigger thing. I need to make sure that's something I want to take back and start thinking about how I'm going to use those next year more. Because I forget not everybody does do the thing. Like, even though we've had all these classes, sometimes I'm like, well, this is the way we've got to do it. It's the way it's always been done. And those choice boards would be excellent for kids at varying levels, especially if you've got like in a classroom, you've got kids who are reading at that kindergarten level and then some that are, you know, within maybe a year of their grade level and there's a 5-year span. If this one can show what they know with a poster and labeling things, and the other one is wanting to write a report and maybe doesn't want to get up and show it, those are excellent. So I need to try to take a page out of your book and incorporate that more.
And did you say that you use the choice boards like at the end of a unit or at the end of a novel, or just whenever you want?
Both. I especially like to do them at the end of novels that we've done in book clubs or literature circles or something, but anytime that I can incorporate it, I try to. For instance, we're reading that novel in the 7th grade social studies room I've been in this year, but with one of the classes, we didn't quite have time to finish it. And so I wanted them to be able to show me what they learned about World War II, and they could use the novel to connect with what they learned in that unit, but it was mainly to showcase their learning from the unit, not just the novel.
So a question that I have many that have popped up at this point, but Do we feel that assessments have to strictly assess the skills and strategies?
I don't think so. Like, are you referring to like literacy skills and strategies, reading strategies?
Yes.
Well, when it comes back around to knowing your students, everything that you assess, like you are going to get to know them more and how they're growing while they're with you. And that's not just going to be literacy skills. It's going to be all sorts of skills, every type of skill out there.
And do we feel that there is ever an appropriateness or a place for those summative assessments, those multiple choice, end of course exams, end of book exams? Do we feel that those can ever be appropriate?
What do you mean when you say end of book exams?
So after they finish a book, maybe it's a multiple choice test, or when it's an end of grade level exam, do we any of these major summative assessments, the end of units exams, things like that, do we ever feel that they are able to be appropriate and equitable?
I think because to me, those are two, like if we're talking about a book we have discussed in class and went in depth and we've truly taught it, I don't know about specifically the ABCD multiple choice, but this is something we've worked on, we're finished. Let's see what you can truly show overall, but at the same time, not put that stress on it of, we want to see what you did. I hope you did well, but not, making it 80% of a grade, if that makes sense.
So
And that's where I struggle too with the standardized test. I do think there's a need for the data to an extent, but I think we put too much stress on how vital they are. Like we were talking earlier, that one number on one day.
that's a really good point, and it's a good point to remind people that are going to watch this about that it's like it's such a high equivalent of a grade, because that's not the same in every district or every state.
Right.
So, but what you just talked about also, you said as they're reading, there's a lot of discussion showing that they're getting it. So then I guess my question and curiosity is, then why do you need the summative? Like, what is the need for that? Like, and how do you ask those questions then?
I think it's kind of a tricky question, because as
Yes.
long as the state is putting so much on us with standardized testing, we're gonna have to play the game a little bit and teach them how to take those tests. But we cannot put all of our eggs in that one basket. We as teachers need to remember that we have watched them across a whole year, a whole unit, whatever it may be, and their growth is showcased through all of that, not just that one test. So yeah, maybe we give them that summative test to help them learn how to take those tests, but that's not what it's about. I mean, that's why I think it's a tricky question, because as long as we are graded as schools and students are looked at that by the state, looked at that summative test, like we're gonna have to do it some. But if they got rid of it, then I would say no.
And just to add on to that, as you were saying, like they're going to take tests throughout school, like in different career fields. So it is important that we're preparing them. And it's also really important that we kind of break down the makeup. I think a lot of my students today, as we were taking the EOG, you got 4, answer choices. 2 of them you can almost immediately eliminate. Then you have 2 that are really close. You're picking the best one. So also kind of taking away that stigma, like I think that will help too, understanding that this is based on your current performance. This is not your future performance. This is not all these other things. But then also, you got to be able to kind of read to figure out what it's asking of you and understand like the tricks of it, And so we kind of make a joke. I'm like, they are going to give us the most boring passage there is. They're trying to see that if, you don't know anything about this person, you don't care about this person, that you're still able to figure out, author's purpose or the theme. So I think that having those real conversations with students. So I don't know if I can say that there is an equitable multiple choice assessment, but I do think it is important that we don't completely eliminate that if that's what they're going to have to do, throughout life.
And I'm thinking with what Kelli just said, and I teach both an ELA class and a study skills class. In study skills this last quarter, I made a point to pull release test items and show them those strategies. And I think if nothing else, teaching those tier 2 words, the describe, the analyze, the list, detail, all of those different pieces, that could be what some of those summative end of unit, end of novel assessments also have that dual purpose of, okay, let's work through this as a class. I want to make sure you understand what this is asking instead of it being all about the content, because that's as much about the test and how to do it as it is the content of the test. A lot of times, if you don't know what the question's asking, you're going to have a much harder time of getting it right.
So what I hear a lot of, because the reality right now is that there are these end of grade tests, there are these state assessments, in different grade levels that really are the data determines what happens with the student and with the teacher in the school, with grades, graduation, all these different parameters just based on an assessment. And so because of that, a lot of class time is going towards not teaching your content or your discipline, but having to teach a test. And so if you had the ears of legislatures or ears of a superintendent, or an administrator, whomever it would be, what would be your recommendation of how would you look at assessment data? Like, what would you want them to do to be able to say, this is what my student can and can't do? And the caveat with that is I think about that case study, you all had to do multiple different types of assessment that assessed some of the same skills, but allowed you to assess fluency in multiple settings so you could really determine patterns and trends. And so if you're thinking about the skills of an ELA classroom or a reading classroom, what would your recommendation be to somebody to make a change? So you're not just teaching the language of a test question. I'm terrible at asking questions. I'm sorry. They're very wordy and confusing. I know.
I think
sorry, go ahead.
Okay. And this may not exactly be what you're asking, but one of the things that I really wish we could do more of, and I know it would be insanely difficult for grading, and they want the standardization and being able to compare kids from Roanoke to kids from Cullowhee. I get that they, our education system wants that. But I really wonder if we could go to some sort of portfolio or something that's a little bit more subjective. If that would benefit us in truly showing what the kids can do versus, as Olivia said at the beginning, showing their weaknesses, showing where they're struggling with those standardized tests. Instead, okay, here's what we did for XYZ. And they used to, I feel like in North Carolina at one point, there's standard core, there's extend 1 now for our students who do have, ID mild, but there used to be a middle of the road thing with a portfolio assessment for kids who still did have to take those assessments. But that portfolio, I think it was extend 2. It's been 15 years. I was at school for the deaf student teaching. They were able to show their knowledge, and that stood in for some of their assessment. And I wish there was a way to do that for a lot of our kids, even though I know it would take resources, it would take time. It would truly be what's right for the kids, possibly.
I like that idea, Alicia. Well, I was going to say, which I don't know if this is the right answer. It's just a thought that popped into my head, but we've got to trust our teachers more. If we are going through school and being hired to do this job and we are the best of the best, then we should be trusted as professionals. I can look at my kids and say, oh, they're doing a good job. They're developmentally where they need to be as a 6th grader, 7th grader, 8th grader, whatever. And that, a portfolio is a great idea. I feel like that the one thing with that might be that it's hard to grade or assess or whatever, which I mean would still kind of come back to some sort of standardized thing.
Rubric or something.
Right. But the teachers we are the ones who are in the classroom with them all year long. We can see the growth and the trends and all the things that we're doing through multiple assessments. And that, I mean, if you're going to put us in the classroom, then trust us to do our job.
I definitely don't know if mine is what you were asking for, but we need more time to read. If we're asking kids to read outside of class, we should have in-class time for them to read. And I think that that is not happening in a lot of places. And then exposure, like we're reading the story and then we can solidify what they've learned by, different field trips, and I don't think, obviously, because of money, enough of that is happening. I think that would really help to cement a lot of, this comprehension and learning if we had these real life experiences for them. So that would be my recommendation.
I love place-based learning. And so I think that you're all touching on the ways that we can authentically learn what our students know or don't know. And I think that's really important. And so I'm going to open it up for the last final questions or thoughts, or if there's something that somebody wants to say, or I know Charlene had that question that she wanted to ask everybody. Go ahead.
So I want to ask a question though, based on, I am ignorant of this. In North Carolina, do those end of grade or standardized tests at the end count a portion of a student's grade? Like 20% or 30% or?
In
Are the
high school
grades
they
on-
do, but not,
Okay.
well, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure in high school it does count as part of their grade because they cannot
Part of their grade.
move on to the next grade if they, or at least the next course up, if they don't pass their final test.
But
If you're
then don't they like there's like credit recovery and different things like that too, right? Like they can like summer school type things, but it's still, you do have to pass that test in high school for those EOG courses.
so it's that
EOC.
way.
EOC,
Yeah.
sorry, yeah.
So I could be wrong. The middle school that I volunteer at here in Wake County, I do think that their EOG test is, I mean, I think it's like 40% of their grade.
I've
Yeah.
never seen that before.
Maybe
But
it's
that's
just
In
at school.
Texas,
not happening.
yeah, in Texas, our finals counted as a portion, but not at the school I'm at here in North Carolina, not EOGs.
So what happens to the opposite kind of kid that does nothing really all semester, but aces these end of grade courses? I mean, they know it from absorption, they didn't have to do the work to understand it and they demonstrate it. Are they penalized by having to stay back? Or you just don't see that happen?
I think that would be a district or school decision. more than-
Mhm.
Yeah. At least in my experience, I don't think there's a statewide rule about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So my question that Rochelle was referring to, I came out of a higher ed where we were teaching underprepared college students, and we were teaching 8th grade, 9th grade, 6th grade math, reading, and English. And we reverted to, we had a multiple assessments that anyone would work at the end, and they could go into freshman English or freshman algebra. But we moved to mastery learning, where you had to demonstrate that you could do, and I'm thinking more of math, but it applied to reading also. Is there a place that mastery learning can coexist with equitable assessment, where there's a base of knowledge that you just absolutely have to have, and it doesn't matter how you demonstrate it, but you have to have this base of knowledge? So if it doesn't matter how you demonstrate it, then equitable assessment can come in with it. But mastery learning is where there are certain things that you have to know or accomplish to move on. And I guess I'm thinking of the sciences and the chemistries and the math, especially because they are such scaffolded content.
I was going to say that makes much more sense with math, because like you've got to be able to add and subtract before you truly can go in division and multiplication.
Right.
And I'm trying to think of how that would equate with reading, because it's so intertwined. Yes, they're like bare bone skills, but then eventually it's, you know, your vocab, your comprehension, everything starts mingling.
Mm-hmm.
So
I just wondered, because my last experience with assessment was mastery learning, you know, and so the whole idea of equitable assessment, I understand it based on what they used to say about IQ tests, that they were skewed toward the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? I mean, we grew up with that. And I thought that things were opening and broadening as far as the types of reading passages they were doing. But still, like here in Charleston, there are people that live in North Charleston that have never been to the beach. And so they're at an extreme disadvantage to anything that would, like you said, refer to the beach. Just curiosities.
I've been putting in chat, so the local TV station, news station had an article on it. And so the consequences are not passing it. Students can be held back. And so unfortunately, this is an inequitable consequence as well, because it means that the principal has to like the student or not like the student, just want the student to go forward. You know, it ultimately, like a couple of the things I clicked on, everything came back to it's the principal's decision.
Oh, wow.
I would even say that it's more than that, because I heard from an admin one time, it is not my current admin, that it was very, very hard to hold a kid back in a tested grade once they get to third grade and above, because, or even any grade maybe, but I know it happened some at the elementary school I worked at, but they pretty much told me they wouldn't because the superintendent didn't like it because it affected our graduation rate. So is that helping kids or not?
Yeah. Other questions or follow-up comments from the panelists, from the people that are attending? I didn't ask that Olivia, Kelli, or Alicia, you want to share? Well, then I want to thank everybody that is here. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank anybody watching live. And just want, because we know that the end of a school year is busy for all educators, teacher educators, current practicing teachers, and people in schools. And so we decided to keep this theme of equitable assessments and grading May and June. And so just a shout out that we will have Dr. Laura Boyle for our June webinar, which I believe is going to be June 13th. So it's very soon. And she's really going to talk about grading. And so equitable grading, what does this mean? What does this look like? And so exploring ways that teachers can implement more equitable grading practices in their classrooms. And so without further ado, I'm going to stop the recording. If I can figure out, there we go.